Welcome to the Wealthy Speaker Podcast, brought to you by the Wealthy Speaker School. This is the podcast dedicated to people who want to speak more as a way to build their income and grow their business. Well, welcome everyone to the Wealthy Speaker Podcast. I'm your host, Jane Atkinson, and today we're going to do a deep dive into the speech itself, into presentation skills, what makes you rock the stage, and what could result in a flop. Now, my guest is one of my longtime friends, Darren LaCroix. Welcome, Darren.
Hey, Jane. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, I am so excited to have you on the show and really dive into what makes a speech epic. Your kind of big claim to fame and what put you in the spotlight was winning a world championship of speaking. Now, this is not a small feat. How many people did you have to beat in order to claim this title?
35,000 people from 14 different countries.
That is amazing. So let's talk about this competition. Tell everybody what it is and how and what your path was to world champion.
Sure. So if you're not familiar, it's held at the annual convention at Toastmasters. It's actually a 6-month process, and it starts, you compete at a small, lower level in front of 20 people. And then if you win that, you go to the next level. So there's 6 levels. And finally, the culmination is at our national convention. And my year, it was in Anaheim, California. You're in front of 2,000 of your peers. And so it brings it down to the top 10 finalists in the world. So talk about pressure.
Yeah.
But let me back up a step too, Jane, because there's a reason why I entered the contest, and it wasn't about the trophy. And I think it goes back to, we've heard it before, but your bigger why. And truly, I didn't know I was entering this contest for the world championship. I thought it was like a local New England contest. And I had a mentor. And I think this is a thing for all presenters and speakers that, we're trying to find that story, that signature story. That's what I heard in NSA. You've got to have that signature story that you're known for and everybody wants to hear again and again. What's that story? And I was like that little creature from Lord of the Rings lusting after finding my story, like, precious. And one of my speaker/comedy mentors saw what I was doing, and I would go for it. I would find a story, I would try it, and I would throw it away. I would try another story and throw it away. I'd try another story. And he said, Darren, stop. He said, stop trying to find that story that will launch your career. And instead, take the stories you already have and make them so good, someone will pay to hear them. And that was, to me, that was a whole new perspective. I didn't realize there's, world-class techniques, world-class processes that you can follow. I just thought, here's a story. And sometimes a lot of presenters, they want to be amazing and they have story envy. We see the person who is on the side of the cliff and has to cut their arm off in order. And we think, oh my gosh, I wish that would happen to me. No, you don't. No, you don't.
It's not worth it, people.
And I encourage people to think, if it's okay and normal to be jealous and envious of a great story, which is amazing. But what I think we miss is story process envy. That person went through a process. We're seeing the end result. We're not seeing the work, the effort, the coaching, and all that went behind it. So in 2001, I've been in National Speakers Association for 7 years. I was in Toastmaster for 7 years, 4 clubs, stage time. I'm speaking anywhere and everywhere I could. I had my day job still. And so I was speaking, marketing, and doing everything. The one thing I wasn't doing was working on my craft. And that's what Dave was saying. So in 2001, I saw this little flyer came around about this speech contest. And I said, well, at least I'll pull out one of my best stories and I'll put it in the Toastmaster format with my whole goal to work on it, and make it so good that I can't lose because the story is getting better. And that's going back in my keynote. I don't know if you ever heard Craig Ballantyne's phrase. He says, if you want to master peace, you have to master the pieces. And so that's what I was doing. I was pulling one story out just to make that so good. And I kept winning, which was great because I kept having a chance to improve it even more. And then the top 3 levels of the contest, you have to have 3 different stories. And so I had two really good ones that would fit in that format that I used in my keynote. But then when the World Championship came, I had to start from scratch because I was out of stories that would work in that format. So, yeah.
So you became a master of piecing together the epic presentation. And what I really wanted people to hear that story for was so that they would understand the work that it takes to get a speech to epic. How long of a format was that final contest?
I mean, the contest is only 5 to 7 minutes.
5 to 7 minutes.
Yeah.
And what story did you end up telling to win?
That was the new one that I had to create. So the first one was the story of my first time on stage and how bad I was, and that you need to take that first step. So that was from my keynote, and I put it back in my keynote.
Right.
And I want to revisit that story and where it's gone since then later on. Just real quick, I got a great story about. Ooh, that was cool.
Okay.
Anyway. And so I'm working on my 45-minute keynote. So I was really trying to improve the keynote as opposed to, be great Toastmaster. Toastmasters is a phenomenal place to make mistakes. And I think if we don't stretch ourselves in that comfortable bubble, we're never going to reach our full potential out in the real world.
Okay. So what speech did you end up using to win?
So my championship speech, you can find it on YouTube. It's called Ouch. And it's ouch. And it's the story of how I took the step after the ouch. And I told my parents I wanted to be a comedian. And they told me I was crazy. I was stupid. That's not for me. And how strangers can tell you you'll never make it. People who love you will tell you you'll never make it. And I interwove that with the analogy of Dr. Robert Goddard, because I didn't want to use some cliche motivational story we've heard 100 times.
Right.
But I grew up in the city that Dr. Robert Goddard launched the first rocket fuel in history. So I took his story and interwove it with mine, that the first one only went 41 feet high and he was trying to reach the moon. And the New York Times put out a headline, "Moon rocket misses target by 238,799 and a half miles." So I used that as but he did, now there's Goddard Space Centers named after him. So a lot of people don't know that story, but since I had a personal tie to that story, I interwove it with my own trying to become a comedian, thanks to the quote by Brian Tracy that changed my life. He said, "What would you dare to dream if you knew you wouldn't fail?"
So good. So that really is kind of one of our first tips, everybody, is to really look at where you can come up with original material, because you're looking at the Goddard plan for space travel. I guess that was what the idea was, right? That was not something that was on everybody's radar. It wasn't a story that everybody had already heard. And I just really think that that's something that's absolutely key to getting to epic, is stories that people have not heard before, right?
Yeah, you could tell it better than anybody else, but if we've heard it before, we're kind of checking out, and we question the credibility of all your other stories.
All right. So now you run a school for speakers. So we're going to talk about that here in a second. But you see a lot of presentations. And I would like to know, what do you see that's kind of missing in the average presentation?
Yeah, the average presentation, I have a list of the top 10 speaking mistakes. And one of the biggest ones is so let me back up. Let me set this one up, because this was a mistake I was making before I got coached. I had never been coached before 2001.
Okay.
And when I had to write the new version of the new speech, because the other two had been used, they both won, and now I had to write a new one. I had met my coach, Mark Brown, CSP, world champion of public speaking from 95. And I was so excited. He gave me this process to follow. And I drove 2.5 hours from Boston to New York to work with him. But this was before emails was big. And I I didn't want him to see the speech ahead of time. I wanted to see the joy on his face when I handed it to him so he could just, maybe give a couple little tweaks. And if you don't know Mark, he stands about 6'2". He's got a heart of gold. He's a native of Jamaica, and he's got this beautiful booming laugh like the guy from the old 7-Up commercial. Ah, ha, ha, ha. That was my coach. I handed Mark the speech, the greatest speech in the history of the contest, which started in 1938, and handed it to him. I just waited. You could hear choirs of angels. Good to have a sound effect machine.
I love it.
Mark took the speech and he looked at it. He shook his head. He said, "Oh, Darren, we have some work to do." Like, what? I wrote the greatest speech that I could write. I followed your process. But you don't know what you don't know. I think that's key. And he could see in 2 minutes what I couldn't see after 7 years. So, find a coach. Get coached by Jane, someone, anyone. You just don't know what you don't know. And one of the biggest mistakes, sorry.
Well, I just want to be clear. I don't do presentation skills coaching per se, but I do have quite a number of coaches in my world, and Darren being one of them. We're going to put your link in the show notes, and people can check out what it is that you do. So there's lots of great coaches out there for presentation skills.
And you got to find the right coach. It's not like, here's this person, or you want to brag about being coached by this person. And it's just like, no. That might not be the right one. What are your issues? What are your challenges? Anyway, one of the big mistakes, to answer your question, that Mark could see in 2 minutes that I couldn't see after 7 years, is most presenters tell their story in narration as opposed to dialogue.
Ooh, okay. Let's dig into that. Let's unpack that a little bit.
Sure.
Give me a before and after kind of example, or how would you take a line and change it to be narration versus dialogue?
So Lou Heckler, a great speaker coach, says, take us, don't tell us. Take us to the moment. Don't tell us about the moment. So when I gave Mark that first version of the speech, I have this pivotal story in my speech where I go home to tell my parents that I finally found my dream and I want to be a comedian. Right. Now, you got to understand my background. I'd never been on stage. No one ever said you're funny. And, I was the quiet, shy kid. So the way I originally told the story was in narration, past tense. I was telling you about the story. So it sounded like this. So I went home to tell my parents I wanted to be a comedian, and they were speechless. They didn't know what to say.
Right.
Okay, which is, there's no real emotion connection. There's no scene in your head. You don't feel an energy shift. And so that's the problem, that we're not creating that emotional connection.
Okay.
So what Mark did was help me switch it into, so I was all excited. I went home. Mom, Dad, I want to be a comedian.
His face is falling, everybody.
Yeah. My face went from excited to dropped. So my parents never even say anything in the story, but you picture the scene. And then I step out of the scene and I look back and I said, they were silent. Ouch. And so I think that's another big mistake, is that people don't block their stories. They don't realize when you're in dialogue, you're in one location. And like at my events, I put out a hula hoop. It's like you're in this hologram. You're in the story. There is no audience. But as soon as you step out, now you can acknowledge the audience. Now you're the presenter again.
Interesting. So blocking is a way of using the stage. What do we see a lot of? If we were to continue on the mistakes path, we see a lot of back and forth caged lions. And what you're saying is be very strategic about how you stand in one place to do one thing. That's what that place is for. Like, where do you go to make your most pivotal point, key ideas? Is that like stage center?
Well, stage center is a power place, but more importantly, and there are different power places, but more importantly, I want to get the idea across: have a reason for moving.
Right. Have a reason for moving.
I like that. And I always say transition phrase, transition on stage. have a phrase which communicates to the audience that you're moving now. You're going from one story to another story. It's kind of like when you're reading a book, when you're done with chapter 1 and point 1, you flip the page and there's a big 2 on the next page. Well, why do they do that? For clarity. On stage, we dilute the effect of our message when we're moving without purpose.
What would be a good transition phrase that you would hear?
So if you're done, I mean, it could be very simple. It could be your foundational phrase that pays, that Doug Stevenson calls it. But that just indicates you're done with one point, you're going to the next. So in mine, I was paralleling my story of wanting to be a comedian and everyone think I was crazy, and Dr. Goddard's story of having this dream to get a rocket to the moon and everyone thought he was crazy. So mine was Dr. Goddard had a ridiculous idea. And then boom, I tell the Dr. Goddard story from that place on stage. Okay. And then I turn around and I say, here's my transition back to me. As I'm moving, I say, I remember when I had my ridiculous idea.
Got it.
I was driving down the road. So it's just taking the time to actually say, okay, I'm going to move. This is my phrase that's going to say, I'm done with chapter 1. I'm done with point 1. Or like if I'm doing a keynote on presenting, I might say, so if you want to be world class, the second thing you need to know is this. So it's a clear communication that we're done with that point. We're moving to the next point. And by the way, your slides, if you're using slides, should mirror
transition with you. Okay, I like that. You're giving us a lot of good juice here. For the skeptic who says, you know what, Darren, all of this stuff is going to feel too inauthentic to me, let's just address that, because talk about how craftsmanship can actually allow you more room for authenticity.
Well, and it goes when I'm coaching somebody or teaching somebody, it's 99% of what we're helping them with is clarity, clarity, clarity. So you can either use the stage to clarify your message or use the stage to dilute your message. You choose. And if you're not even thinking about it, you're diluting it because you're confusing, because the audience is sitting there. It's an experience, you and them. And so I love what Patricia Fripp says. She quotes Sir Laurence Olivier. She says, the art is in hiding the art. And so
I love her. You and she were both in my NSA Las Vegas audiences last couple of weeks ago.
That means you're the real deal.
And I've got to tell you, that was some serious pressure. And I don't think I really did a great job in the afternoon, but I did feel like, okay, I think I pulled it out in the morning. But I just got to tell
Jane.
I got to tell you, that was a little nerve-wracking to have people with such amazing, there were actually probably 4 or 5 speech coaches in the room. No pressure there, Jane. Pressure. But I'll tell you what, just for the person who does get nervous about things like that, and you may have a saying that you have, I just say, look, they are there because they do want to know what it is that I know. And I do come at this industry a little bit differently, but also that they put their pants on one leg at a time. What do you tell yourself when you have a high stakes presentation and you're nervous? What's something that we can share with people that would be helpful?
Yeah, early in my career, I was teaching a group of CEOs and I was still insecure. I still didn't know who I was. And walking into a room of CEOs who could buy or sell me in a dime, I had to kind of step back. Number one, talk to your mentors, talk to your best friends, because they'll help remind you who you are and your expertise. That's huge. And so I had to go back and say, okay, they're CEOs. They know how to run businesses. Most of them suck at presentations.
Right.
And this has been my gig for back then, a decade, now 2 decades, but back then. So I had to almost like reassure myself that, look, I have a purpose and I can help them build their companies through better presentations. So you almost got to step back a little bit. And, and that's why too, when, you're in the room, like I love you, respect you, and I'm a fan of yours. So yeah, I was there, but I was cheering you on. I wasn't there. I was there to learn. I wasn't there to judge.
I said, throw away the evaluations.
Jane, real quick on what you were saying is when you're trying a new technique. So if this is a new technique, Look, anything's going to be a little uncomfortable. But after you get used to it, it's going to make so much of a difference. You're not even going to think of it. When I teach people the hologram thing, like when I show them on stage, they like instantly get it. And I almost never have to say it again. Like Ed Tate, our friend, CSP, he literally on his world championship speech the night before, because he'd been practicing in a normal size room, small room. And now you're on this ginormous stage. So what Ed did is he took these tiny little pink polka dot stickers, so tiny little stickers, and he literally laid out his scenes in different places. So in the moment, he knew, okay, when I tell, here's the story of the ticket counter or the scene of the ticket counter, here's the scene of the food court. So he knew exactly where he had to go. But once you establish this is the food court, that's always the food court for the rest of your presentation.
Right.
So real quick example that will help people understand it. At one of our events, we had this gentleman come and he was telling this very poignant story of his uncle. And he was kneeling at the casket and saying his last words to his uncle. It was very inspiring, very moving too. And then he stood up and he walked on the other side of the stage and he's moving and he says, so our family decided we weren't going to mourn his death. We're going to celebrate his life, and we're going to do that by having a picnic. And then he said, we grabbed our blanket and our picnic basket and we walked to the park. And he walks to the same exact spot and throws out the picnic blanket, and they proceed to have a picnic. And the audience is like, whoa, what? Like you're eating on top of the casket? Like, because the presenter wasn't even aware, right. But what he was doing is putting one hologram on top of another, confusing the audience.
So good. Wow. Really? I
mean,
it's
simple.
Honestly, so much of this is around becoming, I would say we're moving, to use a kind of a Stephen Covey language, from unconscious competence, where you're good, but you're not really sure why you're good, to conscious competence, where you're good because you've planned it that way. You've crafted it to be good. And by gaining more clarity around what you're going to be doing in using this stage when you get out there, that gives you confidence.
Absolutely. It gives you confidence and the audience clarity, which is a great combination.
That is a really good combination. All right. So let's give something that's for the really, really wise, seasoned speaker, the road warrior who's been out doing this for a really long time. I have an idea on something that we could talk about that I think is often missing from a presentation, but I would be open to hearing yours if you have one that's top of mind.
Well, let's go with yours first, and
all right.
We'll go deeper, or I'll give you another one.
You touched on it, and that was the phrase that pays idea. A lot of people, and Victoria Labalme kind of calls it a through line. We could have lots of different words for it. I think there's a lot of people that don't tie their presentations up into a nice, neat little bow with some sort of thing that is the common thread. Do you believe that?
Well, I definitely believe that. I also want to piggyback on that.
Add on to it, sure.
So a through line is, we call it a thread, but a through line, I get it, no problem. Even a movie has a through line. What's the commonality? A TED Talk is an idea worth sharing. Like, well, they say ideas, but each speech is an idea. You can't have 12 points. You can't even have 3 points unless those 3 points back up that 1 point. So number one, absolutely, you've got to have that one theme. And Patricia says it so brilliantly. She says, if I didn't give you an hour and you could only say one sentence, what would you say? And clarity, like that 10-word or fewer premise that you're trying to get across. What's the idea or point you're selling? That's so, so important. And that's the beginning of your presentation. So if you're not clear on that, you're working really hard without purpose. And, hey, write another speech, if you want another point. But if we don't have that common thing. The other idea is a foundational phrase, which is not the through line, but it is maybe the foundational memorable phrase of that story. So it becomes, it's 10 words or fewer. And I learned this from Craig, 10 words or fewer, and it has rhythm. It can rhyme, but it has to have rhythm. And so one of the tools that we suggest is rhymer.com, RHYMER.com. You put in a word and it gives you all the words that rhyme, but sit down and figure out what's that phrase you want them to remember 3 days, 3 months, 3 weeks later. What's that phrase that's sticky? Because if you're telling a story and the whole idea is to plant the seed of that phrase, you have to tell the story around that phrase. So you might have a great idea or a funny line that will take us off track and now confuses us. But if it's on track, that helps you know what needs to stay in that story. So for example, I have stage time, stage time, stage time. Okay. Don't be perfect, be present. The audience doesn't want you perfect. They want you present. We say, if people aren't preparing, if they're not fully prepared and their mindset before they go up on stage, we said skill set without mindset will leave your audience upset. And so it's just that catchy, memorable phrase that gets that audible, that's how you know when you get it. You test it on your friends. If they go, then all of a sudden, boom. And by the way, I have my Jane notes here too. So I'm working on redoing my website thanks to you.
That's so nice. So let me ask you this. Would you recommend that people have multiples of those within one presentation? Or would you recommend that they have kind of one that they keep coming back to so that when the audience leaves and they say, well, what did they say? If they could just remember one thing.
Yeah, we've got to know as the presenter what's our main point. So I'm okay if you at least have to be clear of what is that one that you want them to remember. But it doesn't mean that you can't have other foundational phrases that wraps up a point and makes a point sticky.
Okay, yeah,
so
I like
you have the story is sticky, and then you have the whole message sticky. So you might have that big one and some other ones that just tie things up nicely in each point of wisdom.
And I want to mention that famous Let It Go speech that we've talked about Joe Calloway gave in Phoenix years and years ago.
Unbelievable.
We have it inside the Wealthy Speakers School as a point of learning for our students because it's such a good thing to examine. We just had Joe on master's call. I asked him on our master's call, what was your favorite speech that you've ever given? And that indeed was his favorite speech. And at the end of the speech, the speech was called Let It Go. There was one point. It was, what do we as speakers need to let go of in order to move our business to the next level? And he left before it was over, which we then had to let it go of the idea that the speaker's going to come out, going to be there till the end. That was something that we had to let it. So he had on the PowerPoint on the screen, there's Joe on the plane. Let it go. He's really not coming back. And people didn't believe it.
And he left the conference.
They really didn't believe that he was going to do that. And so I held up the phone for him so he could hear this lengthy, it was probably the longest standing ovation I'd ever heard. But I think people just thought he was going to come back out, and he did not. And so it was hilarious. Anyway, Let It Go, I thought, was an amazing phrase that pays. And sometimes the test is, would it look good on a coffee mug or on a t-shirt? And of course, it's almost in the same rhythm as the Nike idea of just do it or something like that, like short and sweet phrase that pays. That's good English, can be really sweet if you can figure out what it is. And I think that's probably the hardest thing for somebody to do.
And the other thing is most people don't take the time to figure it out. They just think it's going to come. And even when Craig and I sat down to create skill set without mindset will leave your audience upset, that was like an hour and a half conversation. But now the effort is multiplied every time we do it. So we're like, okay, what are we trying to get across? We call up Rhymer. It's a brainstorming session. So find a writing or a comedy or a humor or a presentation buddy and just say, okay, let's, we got 3 hours, hour and a half for yours, hour and a half for mine, and let's do this. And it takes focus.
Love
And
it.
sometimes too, you'll say it by accident and then the audience will say it back to you like, oh, that was pretty good.
Yeah.
Another reason to
Eh,
record every time.
exactly. Well, what was it that people really resonated with? And when they're coming up and saying it back to you in the lineup afterwards, then you know you've hit something. All right.
Another quick important point,
Sure.
Jane, for the epic keynote is just what you said. You set it up perfectly. What do you need to let go of in your keynote? When I was working on my championship speech, ouch, I pulled out a couple of jokes from my early days of stand-up comedy. They worked really well. And I had this one joke that was my favorite joke. And it was about people in our lives who are fun suckers, people who suck the fun out of everything. So I have this great line. And the beautiful thing is the punchline is formed in the audience's mind. I never say it. And it was in my speech, and everyone kept leaving talking about the fun suckers because it was so strong, but it was not my point of that speech that I had to let it go. So, sometimes we call it,
Talk about ouch.
exactly. So I call it, killing your babies, those things that you love, but it just doesn't fit. You're trying to force it in, and that hurts the value of your whole message.
Yeah. Annie Lamott in writing talks about murdering your darlings or killing your darlings. Yeah. It's very difficult to do. It's hard. It's hard. Okay. So talk about how you pick yourself up after a blow, after a bomb, something that doesn't go over the way that you did. The very first time you went on stage doing comedy, was that a good experience for you?
Well, that one was because I had zero disbelief and I got one laugh by accident. It was actually just me being in the moment. And I thank God because I watch all these other comedians go up for their first time and they had to get drunk to do it. And I said, you know what? I'm only doing this once and it's going to be all me. I may win, I may lose. And the irony was I was telling this joke about Dr. Goddard and I said the rocket took off and it went vertically. And I did horizontal with my hand because I was so nervous. I'd never been on stage before.
Right.
And I realized my mistake in the moment and I just reacted. I said, shoot. That's not the word I used.
Yes.
I said, and the audience laughed. And I was like, what? What are you laughing at?
That's funny.
And as I walked off stage, I bombed. Everyone in the room thought I bombed. As I walked off stage, this other comedian to kind of console me, he puts his arm around me. He's like, don't worry, man. It's just your first time. And I remember thinking, don't worry. It's my first time. Did you see what I did? I got a laugh.
Your bar for yourself was a laugh.
Exactly.
All
and
right.
I said in that 5 minutes of time, if I had one thing that worked, I can get rid of everything else that didn't and figure out how to reproduce the one thing that did. So I rocked it. It was
so
painful
good
for the audience, but I rocked it. But
good. And I actually think that the point in that is to focus on the good stuff. Focus on what did work. When you get 99 evaluations that are 9 out of 10, but you get 1, 2, what does human nature want us to do? They want us to, wait a second. And so I've heard it even in financial is that you double down on what works and let go of trying to fix the things that didn't work.
Great analogy.
Yeah.
I mean, that's that as long as our ego isn't getting in the way, as long as we're not listening because we don't want to hear the truth. We don't have the guts to hear the truth. We've got to listen to truth. Well-meaning. There's always going to be that 1% who are jerks and they're going to say things that are irrelevant and coming from their world because you hit a chord with them. But for us, we still got to be open to the truth, but we can't focus on the 1 or 2 random. Now, if everyone or a group of people say, I was confused when you told this story. Guess what? It was confusing.
Yeah.
But if one person says
you need
something.
to fix that.
Yeah.
Okay.
But in my championship speech, I do talk about one time I did bomb, to answer your question. And I bombed so bad. It was at a convention of bank board of directors in New England. It was at Chatham Bars Inn. We never forget those emotional memory pegs. And I I was so excited and it was my audience and da da da. Anyway, I bombed and I walked off stage and I said, I will never, ever do this again. And I called my mentor, Rick Siegel. I think you know Rick.
Ooh.
From New England.
Yep.
He was my mentor back then when I first started. And I called up my mentor, Rick, and I said, Rick, I bombed. I died. They hated me. And I thought he was going to say, well, okay, if you need to quit, quit. And he's like, so? I was like, how do you argue it's so? He said, we've all bombed, Darren. And me as a beginning emerging speaker, I didn't think the people who were the legends, the leaders that I had met, the true professionals, I didn't think they ever bombed. So I thought I don't have what it takes. So I say, reach out to the person who's a mentor, who loves you, who will tell you the truth, but also be there to remind you of your value.
Right.
Because we're not right for every audience.
Having talked numerous clients down from the ledge, and I say that very
Call Jane.
Very metaphorically. Please know that I understand mental illness is a serious conversation. But having talked a few clients down, one thing I recognize is that when you flip it around, so the next speech, you're going out because you're going to likely be already booked for something else into the future. And when you focus of coming from a place of service, rather than from a place of needing to prove it that you're good, I think when you flip it around and make it about the audience and serving the audience, that can sometimes take you out of your head on the bomb. Just a little interesting little side note there. Darren, you have given us a treasure trove of juicy nuggets here. What's one thing that we haven't discussed yet that you want to make sure that speakers know?
I remember when I was getting ready to go on stage the night before the World Championship, the most pressure of your life. Now, it doesn't matter if it's a speech contest, a bunch of clients, your biggest audience ever, the toughest audience ever, the actuarial math engineers of America, that audience that intimidate, whatever one that is, high school students, that's one of my intimidators.
Sure.
Anyway, Mark Brown, my coach, this goes back to skill set without mindset will leave your audience upset. The mindset that you take on stage, if you're going out, like you said, Jane, to prove yourself, you're playing with fire. And Mark brought me back whenever he saw that once in a while I would lust after the trophy. So, I was there, I was for service, but every once in a while, oh, the trophy. Yeah.
The gold, yeah.
He would see that on my face and he would reel me back in. Excuse me. And he said, Darren, tomorrow morning, you have the privilege of 2,000 lives for 7 minutes. What will you do with that?
That's good.
And when we can remind ourselves that we do have a privilege, and I don't care if you're talking customer service, there's still somebody in the audience you can give hope to. If you're talking about the new 401k plan or some business thing, it's like, yeah, it's not exciting, but you still have a good story that you could tell that could touch the right person. So when I was in China a year and a half ago, I was speaking in 2 different cities and I had a day off. I was at the museum and I went to this one exhibit and I had these 2 handlers who were with me and translating for me. And I got locked into this exhibit and they're like, Mr. LaCroix, we need to go. Mr. LaCroix. I'm like, no, there's a metaphor. There's something, there's a message here. And it was this, I show it during my speech, and it's this exhibit with all these pots, but they were all these broken pieces and they were put back together with white plaster. And so any piece that was missing, it was just white plaster. So you could see the missing pieces, but it put it back as a whole. So it could function as a pot if you were to do that. And it was just such a great visual. And I realized that every time we're in front of the audience, they're smiling, but we are that white plaster. We are hope. As Terry Paulson said once, we are merchants of hope. And every audience, they might be smiling at you, but inside there, they just found out their son is hooked on drugs. Their mom has cancer. There's something, everyone's carrying something. And when we can walk on stage and know that if we choose to be a speaker, choose to be an unforgettable speaker, because we can deliver that hope. And it's our intention, just like you hear in my voice right now, it's our intention that matters.
Beautifully said, Darren LaCroix. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. Tell everybody about what you do to help speakers improve their craft.
Thank you. Thank you. So I have a podcast. I love podcasts. I'm new to mine, but it's been taking off, and it's called Unforgettable Presentations Podcast. So if you like this theme, definitely check that out. And we've interviewed Jaj. Do you remember Jia Zhang from NSA? The rejection guy? He was a great interview. Mike Rayburn. Anyway, so we interview unforgettable presenters to find out their stories and their strategies. And then I have an online university called Stage Time University. You can check out stagetimeuniversity.com. And we focus on the content, the structure, stories, humor, and then delivery. Like, that's what I call the core four. So we have master programs in each, and we have live coaching calls every single week. So our members can get coached by 2 world-class coaches.
I love it. I love it. Well, I hope, you know what, if you're new to the industry or if you've been around a while, you could probably use a little refresh. And sometimes we need to throw out some material and audition it to see if it's going to make it back in. And I think that that's a great idea for you to go into Stage Time University and check that out. Darren, thank you so much for your time today.
All right. Thanks, Jane, for having me.
I appreciate you. And folks, if you have appreciated the Wealthy Speakers Show, please let us know. Reach out to us in some fashion and let us know that you're listening and that you are enjoying it. And with that, we will say, see you soon, Wealthy Speakers. Bye for now, everyone. Hey, thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed our show, you'll want to come and visit us at the Wealthy Speaker School, where we provide a proven roadmap for building your dream business. Go to wealthyspeakerschool.com. And for show notes for today's podcast, head on over to speakerlauncher.com and click on podcast. I'll see you soon, Wealthy Speakers.